One of the glittering hopes of the future can be summed up in two words: geothermal everywhere.
If the world's going to decarbonize in a reasonable time frame and at a reasonable cost, we're going to need a low carbon heat source and power source that's 24/7, non-weather dependent, can be implemented almost anywhere in the world.
It is a constant and very efficient source of renewable energy.
There are only a few candidates for that role: nuclear fission and fusion, perhaps carbon capture and storage on natural gas, and super hot rock geothermal.
To get the whole country behind climate action, the solutions can't all be branded as green and left. And that's what's exciting about geothermal. On top of its promise of abundant, reliable, clean energy, it's congenial to fossil fuel states and their vast infrastructure.
Today, heroic individuals who've spent their entire careers working for the very industry that is blamed for the climate crisis are developing the technologies capable of delivering geothermal everywhere.
The ground is shifting under every single one of those hurdles, pardon the pun. It seems like every single one of those hurdles is really loosening, and that is the thing that gives me hope.
We all know that there's unlimited energy right under our feet, but it's been tantalizingly hard to access cost effectively.
I am very excited about the possibility that we will continue to develop our geothermal potential.
Drill, baby, drill. For heat, not oil. It's an idea whose time has come.
It's happening. Buckle up. This is going to be amazing.
Okay, y'all, so I didn't understand a word in that video. So in case you all didn't either, we had an audio issue. But the point of that was, the first one you saw was a bunch of geothermal demonstrations, clips from a bunch of geothermal demonstrations that have happened over the last year by oil and gas industry veteran teams, right? So that's oil and gas folks in the field drilling geothermal projects. The second video you saw is a bunch of climate philanthropists, climate activists, climate leaders, and environmental organizations saying, we think this is a really good idea. We think it's a really awesome effort from oil and for oil and gas to engage in this. Let's do it. And so the question becomes, how do we bring these two groups together? Because they don't currently sit together at the same table at the geothermal conversation, right? So wanted to use that to frame the discussion with Karine Kleinhaus. So Karine is Director of Sustainable Finance at the Environmental Defense Fund. And I am super excited to have her, and I wanted to congratulate you for stepping into Pivot this year and joining us here in Houston. So thank you very much.
So great to be here. Very exciting, actually, to be at a Halliburton headquarters and talking to you guys. It's awesome.
So for the benefit of this audience and also the one that is virtual, Pivot is largely oil and gas audience, and many folks in this room and also virtually may not know what EDF does. So let's start there.
Okay, sure. So we are a global environmental organization. We're a nonprofit. We have over 1,000 people working in 30 countries, and our focus is tackling climate change. Our anchor regions are the US, Europe, India, and China, and we're really solutions focused. So our main idea, the main goal is to find solutions and help them be implemented for climate change, to reduce emissions, and to have a nice, healthy planet for nature and for people. So that would be on one foot.
So you've got finance in your title, though. So what's up with that?
Yes. So yeah, I have finance in my title. So EDF is really large. We have a lot of scientists, we have economists, we have policy people, and we have a unit that's called EDF Plus Business. And within that unit is sustainable finance, which is where I sit. And what we do at Sustainable Finance is we work with investors and we talk with them about what good looks like. So when they're interacting with their portfolio companies or if they're lending money, they know what good looks like in terms of climate for the companies they're looking at. So for example, just just to make that a little more concrete, if an investor has a hydrogen company in their portfolio, so you might want to, we have a conversation with them about hydrogen leakage, about applications of hydrogen that are more useful or less useful for climate, that type of a thing. And we produce a lot of research, which is publicly available on these types of investor-focused information. So that's the finance piece.
All right, so y'all see where we're going with this one, right, so far? So a lot of the conversations so far this morning have been about barriers to financing for geothermal. We need a massive amounts of cash for deployment. It's no secret that it's gotten increasingly hard to borrow in oil and gas for oil and gas projects. So as a whole, this industry is feeling a little crunched in terms of finance. And it could be that there is a way that we bridge a gap in terms of advising, these trillion-dollar funds that want to, invest in climate infrastructure and projects, and entities that are excited about piloting. So that's kind of the framework for this discussion. It feels cool and new to have an environmental organization sitting at an oil major's headquarters in Houston to talk about something that is a potential avenue for collaboration. And I think that's really fun. But in fact, it's not really that rare for EDF to engage and collaborate and work with the oil and gas industry. So what say you on that? What are some examples of how you work with oil and gas currently?
So yeah, we're definitely focused on solutions, and we work with small and large industry, and we do a lot of work with oil and gas companies, actually, especially on the topic of methane. So, methane is about 80 times worse of a global greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide is in the short term. And there's a lot of methane emitted, sometimes through flaring, sometimes just through leakage, in oil and gas fields. So we work a lot with oil and gas companies about, ways to monitor, ways to fix that. We model out how actually you could save a lot of money by doing it. We also are investing in launching a satellite early next year that's going to be monitoring leak rates around the world, and that data will be available for people, to look at what they're emitting and to better target where they need to control it. But we have a lot of work with oil and gas companies. Again, it's focused on reducing emissions, clean energy transition, and solutions. And yeah, we're quite focused and very invested in that work.
So, just like as direct as you can be, because I feel like this might be the elephant in the room. What are the obstacles that you see, or the impediments to reaching across the aisle here and building collaborations and, or programs or whatever it is, consortia, whatever it is, with the oil and gas industry from the environmental organization perspective?
Right. Well, the elephant in the room is that, we're looking to tackle climate change, which means stopping greenhouse gas emissions, which means transitioning away from fossil fuels. So there's no getting around that. We can sugarcoat it or not, but that's obviously where I'm coming from. That's what we're trying to do. But I think that there's a huge amount of potential for collaboration. First of all, because as eventually oil and gas use does recede, you have these major companies and huge workforces that you can't leave people high and dry. People need to make money. People need to make a living. People owe things to their shareholders. So there have to be solutions and transitions that are, positive and profitable, as well as climate positive, because otherwise there isn't a lot of motivation or interest in making the shift to a clean energy. So like I said, we have, many people working together with oil and gas on specific issues where, there's common goals. And I think that, you just have to build programs and build relationships and try to find ways to collaborate on what works for both of you.
So we met because you wrote an article that I loved and commented on. And just for background for this audience, I have been trying to engage with environmental groups on the concept of large-scale oil and gas engagement in geothermal for years, and it's been really, really hard. They've been difficult conversations that have not at all been on the record, and you know, it's easy to get traction at first for geothermal generally. The instant you start talking about the oil and gas industry playing any significant role in terms of scale, for sure, so developing projects, things got really hard. And so you wrote an article, and I read it and was really impressed. And forgive me, I just looked up the title and now I've forgotten it again. But it was something like why the oil and gas industry should pay attention to geothermal. You know, why we think that this should be a thing. So what's the why did you write that?
So, I mean, I think it's pretty obvious, right? At least, you know, I think if you look at it, oil and gas, right? They developed fracking technology. They know the subsurface. They developed the technology to know the subsurface. They're massive. They have a tremendous amount of capital. They've had a good couple of years. And geothermal seems like such a nice fit with the capabilities of oil and gas, with the ability to have this highly trained, highly skilled workforce that can be, can have some refinement but be modified. You look at the, all the drilling and the service companies and all the work they're doing on these new drills that can work at, 400 degrees centigrade and higher. There just seems to be a real nice synergy there. And I think that right now we're sort of in this valley of death for geothermal, where, you have these small grants and you have projects starting and you have these little, starting to go commercial scale, but the large funding that you need for a massive CapEx project, you need that from the private sector, right? And we're not really there yet with that funding. So it seems like oil and gas has the ability to create a new industry. I mean, they just did it with shale, right? So this is like another option where they can use their skills and really push it forward into full commercial scale. That's kind of how I see it. And, in terms of the fracking, and just generally in working with oil and gas, I think the question is really fracking is like a technology. It can be done really badly. There have been issues with, water, and there have been issues with seismicity. It's all documented, but it can be done well. There have to be guidelines and best practices and monitoring and all of that. But in the end, if that technology is used to bring clean baseload power, then, that's awesome.
All right, so you said a lot of things that I think are probably a surprise to the Pivot audience. So let's back up and dissect, because it's all good. The first part of what you were saying is oil and gas has all of these capabilities, expertise. By the way, that's them.
Right.
So this room is, every single major oil field service company and a handful of operators and a bunch of others that contribute. And this audience, the Pivot audience, uses typically a different set of terminologies to explain why they are interested in geothermal. And they are about workforce and technology transfer and energy security. We'll hear about that with Ken's panel later in the day for defense. There's a set of terms that play well in this constituency. Same thing, there's a set of terms that play well with yours. And so, that begs the question, what is it about geothermal? And it might be different than what this constituency thinks, but the important part is you both like it, right? So in terms of environmental groups, what are the reasons geothermal is exciting and interesting? What do you see exactly in geothermal that helps you achieve EDF's mission?
So basically right now, even if you were to have, tons of sun and tons of wind in a renewable grid, you still have fossil fuel plants that are providing the baseload power, right? We don't have terrific long-term energy storage as of yet. And that's where the baseload power is from. And so in my mind, the geothermal is really the opportunity to provide clean baseload power. And it's really necessary if we're going to go, to a full renewable grid. So I think that's one, huge reason why geothermal is attractive from an environmental perspective. Second of all, the land footprint is tiny compared to wind or solar or coal for that matter. It's a much smaller land footprint. So, if you put it down, there's less competition for land for other uses. That's another thing. Certainly the workforce transition is a big deal. Another thing about it is that, you really are bringing sort of more energy security and the ability to sort of build out this new industry that can have a lot of value, I think, for the U.S.
Another point you just made that I wanted to touch on again was fracking. So the infamous F word. In this audience, an amazing technological feat, that was decades in the making, driven by visionary entrepreneurs that have revolutionized, energy security for the United States, rearranged global geopolitics, et cetera, right? But the word fracking is actually in environmental circles and climate circles quite toxic. And that's typically, in my experience, where conversations with climate activists and philanthropists and environmental organizations have broken down. So it's the utilization of that technology, no matter for what purpose, the utilization of that technology was a no-go. But you didn't say that just now. So I want to sharpen that a little bit to say, to kind of ask the question again, from your perspective, how do we navigate? Because what I heard you say was it's a technology that can be applied for good, and there have been issues, but if those issues are resolved and mitigated and managed, it could be used for good. So how do we navigate that, right? And what do you see as the pain points and the concerns, and how we step through this over the coming years?
So I think there are a few pieces to that. First of all, I think there needs to be sort of guardrails, or clear guidelines, clear best practices as to how it can be done to completely avoid the damage that's been done in the past in some cases. So issues with fracking fluid showing up in water, all those things that happen. Having really clear guardrails of how it can be done well and how it can be done safely, I think is key. I think the monitoring of what's going on and openly sharing that data is really useful, because the more data that's accumulated and shared, I think the better you can refine what your safeguards are and know what the best practices are in the industry. I think that's certainly another piece of it. There has to be discussion and planning about things like water usage. Where I know in out west in California, rather, they're using wastewater to push back into the wells, to the geothermal wells. Like things like wastewater or desalination. There have to be plans, not to drain our fresh water for this, which is a big concern out west, where a lot of the heat is closer to the surface. So there has to be a lot of science and a lot of attention paid to the best ways to do it. But as just a general idea, I think if you have science, then technology can be made to be useful if it's careful. The other main thing I think that comes up a lot is community engagement. So there's certainly a lot of concern about communities being involved in the process of siting and of their concerns being addressed. And also that communities that are disadvantaged or that might be losing jobs if coal is closing, things like that, that all of those concerns are part of the project planning from the beginning, rather than sort of being unveiled at the end when communities don't really have a chance to, participate or have input in the project. Yeah.
So that's fracking. And let's put that one aside for a second. What else? So are there other concerns or obstacles or, no-go areas or things where we need to hide? That one's obvious, but what are the, other non-obvious ones that we need to be thinking about in terms of building pathways and collaborations forward? Where are the concerns in your mind?
So I think, I can't speak for all environmental NGOs. Obviously, we're, very different. There are a lot of different ones. Everyone has their own, concerns, their own pain points, their own sensitivities. I can really just speak, for EDF's point of view. We're, like I said, we're really solutions focused. So, if we can advance something that's going to bring, clean baseload power, clean electrons to the grid, then, then there's room for conversation, and seeing how we can work together on that. The way we do now, where we do a lot of focus on methane emissions, and we do communicate a lot with oil and gas on methane, on, committing to reducing it, on methods to reduce it. So, like I said, because we have already so much work and so much history with oil and gas, for us, it's not, it's more about the science of the geothermal itself and how it can be done in the right way. That would be, the topic of discussion.
What are the ways that you envision building a pathway for? So when you say, working together or finding, ways to collaborate, what is the detail of that? Like, what are some options? How could, an EDF, or, you could speak more generally, NGOs that are environmental focused and oil and gas, they often, don't get together to work on, for instance, roadmaps and reports, right? It's typically kind of we stay in our silos and maybe we'll find some middle ground somewhere. Are there avenues to actually do something together? So, but building a roadmap forward for geothermal where there's active collaboration between industry and, say, groups like EDF.
So, to be honest, I haven't thought out in detail some, creative ways. I can just say one thing we do is a lot of education, research reports that we share out that will show, what's beneficial or how technology can be done right. We have this isn't happening now, but we have a large subsurface team of experts, many of which were from oil and gas, who are working on things, on other topics like CCS or orphan wells. And, that kind of expertise could be used, and, there could be conversations with, oil and gas experts on how to do it right with geothermal. What are safe ways? What are guardrails? We can potentially talk with investors as well about, if they're looking at geothermal, they're thinking about it for their portfolio, what's good, what looks right, how is it done right? And that's something that, depending on the geothermal company or whoever it is that's doing that, it could benefit them, if they're doing things in a really climate positive way. So there's a lot of different avenues that work. Like for my team, Sustainable Finance, we do a lot of meetings with investors, we put out research, but we have a lot of other teams working in other ways in EDF that, it remains to be seen. This is early days for us. We don't have all of this worked out, but it's something that we're exploring.
Yeah, well, you're in the right place, because Pivot tries to stay on the bleeding edge of all things geothermal, including potentially hard things. And I think this is one of them, right? And I think in this audience, I don't want to put words in mouths. And actually, I just got a cue that we need to do Q&A. So I want you all to be thinking of questions, so we can make this a little bit of a dialogue. But from the point of view of the oil and gas audience, oftentimes I've heard in conversations in trying to engage with environmental groups that it's, we're damned if we do, we're damned if we don't. It doesn't really matter what we do. If we do geothermal, we're still oil and gas. you know, we have that, we have to own that, we are that, but we're never going to be, you know, accepted or loved or cheered on by these organizations because we are what we are. I don't want to accept that, right? Because I feel like there has to be a world where environmental organizations could celebrate a path chosen by oil and gas, and geothermal seems to be one of those, right? So what could you say, what do you have to say about geothermal social license, how oil and gas can, you know, if you're an oil and gas executive trying to consider how to get into this space, how to engage with environmental organizations and the environmental community, how to gain social license in this space, and what would you say to that?
So I would say, first of all, again, you know, environmental groups all differ. In terms of us, like when we, again, I'll just give a more concrete example. When we engage with oil and gas on methane, like if a group or oil and gas is reducing their methane flaring or controlling their methane leakage or monitoring for methane leakage or signing on to agreements to reduce methane, then we'll praise them. If they're not, or if they're doing, you know, unconcerned about flaring and unconcerned about methane leakage, despite, you know, the loss of money from that as well. If they're unconcerned about that, then we will, you know, be very critical. If someone were to, you know, put in 4 geothermal wells for the sustainability report and call it a day, we'll go after that. Like, we're not going to be, you know, happy with that. But if there's a company that's really investing and not just paying lip service to, you know, transitioning and moving into geothermal in a serious way, then, you know, that's something that EDF has acknowledged in terms of just any company that's doing something positive or negative. So, yeah, and like I said, we have a long history of working with oil and gas and with major industry. So, you know, it's for us, it's more about what's actually happening and not, you know, just a label and a lip service. Yeah.
All right, before we segue into Q&A, one last question for you, which is like, what's the pipe dream? So say, you know, you get your wish and geothermal happens the way you want it to. Where is the world in 10 years with regard to geothermal?
Okay, so in my personal opinion, I would say drill, baby, drill, but with guidelines, I guess. I would say my pipe dream is that it's really spreading, that there's a huge contribution to baseload power on the grid from clean geothermal, that the technology really advances for super hot rock, you know, the really deep geothermal, because there you're going to have really low levelized cost of energy, and it's going to be such a game changer. So in 10 years, I would love to see a lot of geothermal, and I'd love to see, you know, real advances in the super hot rock. And yeah, and for real transition and just transition for workers into that space.
Awesome. All right. So did y'all hear that, by the way, super hot rock? So that's another trend. And that's a difference between that I've noticed between environmental organizations, NGOs, climate activists, and oil and gas, because the super hot rock concept is harder to envision somewhat from a technological standpoint in the oil and gas space, not entirely, but it's just a little more difficult. Whereas it is this big vision that is really catching on in climate circles, including with funding entities. So that's another bridge we need to build, because you've got this big vision that could solve energy in the world, and it's a very hard one from a technology standpoint.
Yeah.
It's also something that doesn't get a whole lot of play within oil and gas circles and talking about geothermal, because it is a little bit further out. So anyway, another bridge we have to.
A lot further. It's definitely a lot further out, but you know, that's the pipe dream. But I do think that EGS itself could be a huge driver for decarbonization of the grid, even before super hot rock. So yeah.
Love it. Okay, so I asked y'all to think of some good questions. Anybody got one?
Ambassador from Chevron. At the end of the day, we are all human beings. We care about environment just as well as anybody else. However, As an oil and gas company, when we look at developments that happened in Utah Forge, technological advancements, those are the things to celebrate. But at the end of the day, oil and gas companies are going to invest in projects that can give me returns that are compatible or competitive
Right.
with our oil and gas. We can take a little bit less, but oil and gas companies are for-profit companies, and that is where they would invest. You can get all the money you want. Show me the competitiveness. How will you do that?
So first of all, I would say that obviously if there's no profit opportunity, huge companies are not going to move that way, right? I mean, they are not for profit, they're for profit. They have the fiduciary duty to their shareholders. They're looking to make money. I would say, again, I don't run a large multinational company and not equipped to do so, but I would say that as things change in policy, it's going to be less profitable to be in the fossil fuel business eventually, and it's going to be more profitable to be in the geothermal business or the hydrogen business or other businesses. So I guess if you're taking a long view and you're seeing what's happening, let's say in Europe, or you're seeing what's happening, with their regulation, you're seeing what's being considered here. Again, from a I'm not a CEO, but when I think about it, that's something, if I was thinking about profit, that would be one thing. And the other thing is, you guys did it with shale, right? I think it was like 1 in 10 wells were profitable at the beginning, and 20 years later, like it's 9 out of 10. So, you're the brain trust. So if someone's going to be able to make profit from geothermal, I'm expecting that you guys will figure it out. The third thing I would say is that you have things like the production tax credit in the IRA, right? So that's pretty generous. It's uncapped. And so that's hopefully will help in the near term in pushing that profitability forward. But that's, my own take from it, but I'm no CEO. So, that's what I'll say to that.
That's Matt.
So thank you for your comments. Very fair, balanced, rational. Really appreciate the engagement. And I wish there were many more people like you out there. And that's my question, sort of the other elephant in the room is that people don't like us. And,
Weatherford, Matt Fodder from Weatherford, by the way.
Yeah, from Weatherford. So, how do we get the message out there that we intend to be part of the solution, that we're not bad guys, that we live on this planet and have kids that are going to live here as well? And so we want to be a responsible part of the solution. We have the technology, the workforce, and the investment capability to deploy this technology at scale. How do we convey that message to the broader public that in a way that isn't viewed as greenwashing?
Yeah, I'm not a comms person either, but that's interesting. I think that in the end, if a company is really making significant contributions to cutting greenhouse gases, is really advancing a technology that's got low or no carbon electrons, I mean, and the numbers are there. It's not just 100 million. We prevented 1,000 tons of CO2 this year, which is, laughable. Like if it's real numbers, it's really there and it's really a transition, then I don't know. It seems to me like something a company could work with, could communicate and would be evident. But, it's not the easiest path to walk. It's hard for environmentals. I think, it's hard to find a path with oil and gas, and I'm sure it's hard for oil and gas to find a path with environmentals who are looking to transition away from fossil fuels. It's kind of it's not an easy, way to go. But I think a company that's really reducing CO2 and greenhouse gas, controlling methane, doing things responsibly, engaging communities, thinking about water usage, all of that. I mean, that's companies transforming. So that should be evident in the hard numbers.
Hi, my name is Chris Murray. I'm you'll see me later today representing the U.S. Air Force, but earlier in my career, I actually worked for maybe half a dozen environmental groups. Let's face it, geothermal is not a technology the environmental groups focus on. It's not the top tier issue. Same with oil and gas, geothermal is not the top tier issue.
Right.
From an environmental standpoint, your major leverage from my experience working in the community for years is policy.
Yes.
It's not campaign contributions, it's policy. And so this is a question to both of you. Knowing that we already have the tax incentives, knowing that we have the loan program office, knowing that we have billions of investment that is on the sidelines, for me, it's about projects, getting projects off the ground. What policies can both of these interest groups work on, the enviro and oil and gas? What policies can we put in place to help get more projects off the ground? In other words, what law can you guys draft together? That's what I used to do on also Capitol Hill, drafting laws. So give me the legislative idea that we could pitch to get more projects to get this moving. What would it be?
So that's an excellent question. I mean, policy is definitely a huge bottleneck for geothermal. You know, everything needs to be done, you know, considering the environment and safely. But I think in the last DOE report I read, it takes 6 to 7 years for a geothermal project from, you know, pre-examining if there's even something there to, you know, going online. And it can trigger 5 or 6 NEPA reviews. I think oil and gas wells have some exemptions and they take 2 or 3 years on federal land. And this is for federal land. And of course, a lot of geothermal, we're looking at federal land, right? Because that just happens to be that those 2 maps where the heat is near the surface and where the federal land is the same place. So I think that one area that would be collaborative would be advocating for policies that would you know, make it more efficient for projects to be certified to go ahead. There's a huge amount of bottlenecks. I think there's also unfamiliarity, you know, and lack of staff in the agencies that deal with this type of permitting. So that's certainly an area to move geothermal forward that would be helpful. Another area, I think, like if you compare the amount of funding was committed to hydrogen and what was committed to geothermal, it's staggeringly different. I think it's $9.5 billion or something for clean hydrogen, and a couple $100 million for geothermal, like, you know, moving projects forward to commercialization. Less, you'd say 165 million, 185 million, something like that. I don't know, not a lot, a fraction. And so I think that that's another area where there could be joint efforts to, you know, help bring in private money with public support, whether, you know, whatever form that takes, to move geothermal into the commercial scale. So those are 2 areas I would say of policy that would be helpful.
I have a quick comment about this.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll say the quiet part. So there's a hard piece, a detail there, which I think, Chris, you're getting at this. The hang up on the federal side, which InnerSpace has abandoned federal policy because it's hung up, and we're focused on state policy, particularly in oil and gas states.
Mm-hmm.
But the hang up, we'd have to dive into categorical exclusions and NEPA, and let's not do that. But
Let's not.
the devil's in the details here, and what it is generally the left is terrified of categorical exclusions from NEPA because it's a slippery slope, and that the reason they're terrified of that is because of lobbying from environmental organizations, right? And but the oil and gas industry lobbied for a categorical exclusion for oil and gas wells on federal land. So they're enjoying something that they lobbied for, that geothermal can't get but needs, because environmental groups are scared that a categorical exclusion could turn into a slippery slope. That's where it's hard, right? And so it's like there's a lot of opportunity, but there's devil in the details on this, right? Where it's like everybody likes it, but there's reasons this hasn't happened. And the reasons are the hard part. And like, how do we find ways forward in those details?
So what I would say is, first of all, before getting into categorical exclusions, there's a huge amount of bureaucracy that can be cut that would supposedly, I think that was another DOE report, would have the time that it would take to get a geothermal well approved. You could double the amount of geothermal capacity in the next 10 years if they just streamlined all the regulatory processes. And that was the DOE itself saying that. So before we even go into exclusions and how those are done, and that's way beyond my skill set, like that's our policy team, and I wouldn't want to, step in there, but just the bottlenecking and just their, just in terms of the paperwork and the bureaucracy, already you could achieve a lot for geothermal, and that's by the DOE's own evaluation. So yeah, I'm not a policy, I wouldn't want to.
I didn't want to put you on the spot.
Yeah, no,
We'll pull
totally
in your policy.
fine. Yeah, that I think we don't even have to get to that. I think there's lots that could be done before that.
I'm being waved down by my team. We have one more. Yeah, we have time for one more question.
My name is Kelsey Ketcher. I'm with Southwest Research Institute. So I think my question's a hard one, and I don't know that there's an answer. But how do we get all forms of energy judged on an even playing field? And so let me give an example. So I think oil and gas industry obviously is painted very negatively in the media and I guess in general, because a lot of our, say, emissions are scope 1, right? So you see them at the site. But if you look at, for example, wind, what goes into building a wind turbine? Oil and gas, right? You can't tell me they don't have diesel generators on site when you put up a wind turbine. Or as you have decommissioned blades, those are going into landfills, but none of that makes it to the media, right? So I think wind and solar are great, and I think that they're great moving forward, but how do we get geothermal so it's up there and being judged at a level that's less than oil and gas is being judged? Because I think oil and gas companies have made those strides, like you said, and they're decarbonizing and they're making those efforts, but they're still painted negatively, where maybe wind and solar don't have to do as much because they're already painted as green.
So I would say to that, the real important measure is how much CO2 are you releasing into the atmosphere. So, you can be recycling blades or not, or you can be using, but in the end, the huge amounts of emissions are really, coming out of the fossil fuel industry. So I don't really compare wind and solar with fossil fuel in that sense. And wind and solar is also now the cheapest and the fastest growing new energy sector. And that's where it's going. So, yeah, I mean, obviously everybody has places that they can improve, but I wouldn't make that comparison. I just wanted to add one more thing, which was about the policy. The other thing that really is an issue is transmission and connecting to the grid. And that's also, besides all of the delays with permitting, that's the other huge bottleneck. You can try to finance a project, but you're like, well, it could take me whatever years to build the thing, and then I don't even know if I'm going to be able to connect to the grid. And that's the other main bottleneck for financing. Why would someone tie up their assets in something which may not even, make it to the consumer? So I think that what's interesting is also these, like the DoD talking about using geothermal and hydrogen for their bases, or data centers talking about, geothermal or geothermal and hydrogen together, geothermal to make the clean hydrogen, or geothermal to help with data center power use. Those type of sort of more localized grid solutions are also interesting as we wait for the bureaucratic stuff to clear up.
All right, yeah. Fast, very fast. One minute, very fast, very, very fast.
All right, Alan Steiner, I got a quick. There's an interesting studies that go on in the US, and we talk about this global footprint of carbon dioxide. It turns out 75% of the global carbon footprint comes from just 5% of the super polluters, coal power plants, 5%. So we're all focusing on doing all these things, but at the end of the day, it's 5% that affects 75% of what we have out there. Easily fixed. Get rid of those. It's the East Coast United States, it's India, and it's China. Fix that and almost everything goes away. But when we talk about oil and gas, what I'm worried about is, where do our cosmetics come from? Where does our rubber come from? Where does our fuel? You think about those can't disappear. We still need them. You talk about the electric cars. They take 70,000 miles before they even break even on carbon footprint. You were talking about, the wind and solar. We're repowering turbines after 15, 13 years. turbines, wind power, because they're failing. So all these things, we're not taking in the full life cycle, whereas geothermal is completely different. But oil isn't as bad as people want to make it think. And that's where I'm going with, because we actually need it, right, for so many things. But yet, for somehow or another, it got to be negative. That was my speech. I had to.
Yeah, and just to conclude, because I'm being waved on, and I know y'all want to ask questions, and that's, I mean, just want to say this is the beginning. I mean, and Karine is a brave soul, right? And I commend you for that, because for years I have been inviting environmental organizations to come into this sphere and try to start these conversations, and they will not do it. They would not do it. And it was very hard. So thank you. But like, this isn't the end of the conversation. This is the beginning of the conversation. And, you know, the hope is that we figure out a way to collaborate and make geothermal a thing. And so like this is the beginning of something that will probably turn into stakeholder roundtables that are bigger. And probably Chatham House, because we are broadcast right now live to a global audience. And so things can get a little more substantive and, you know, into the details. And so just keep in mind, and I love the enthusiasm for the audience, but we're throwing all of Pivot's schedule off right now. Thank you for all of your questions. Thank you. Thank you. Karine is here, and she is eager to chat with all of you. And I hope that you will approach her and chat with her. And, you know, I'm also hoping that this becomes a standard for us in engaging with, you know, between organizations and the oil and gas industry to try to advance these conversations forward. So thank you for coming to Pivot, Karine, and I appreciate it.